We will be starting in a moment. If you could take your seats, that'd be great. If you're outside, come on in. In a moment, you can still hubbub for a little bit longer. Okay, I think we'll get started now. Hey, Win. Are we good to go?
Shorter. Sharing. Do you like this?
That one can go off. All right. Hey, everybody. We're going to get started. Okay, so thank you all for being here. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for getting up early in the morning for this, especially those of you who are upside down as far as your body clocks go. Well done. Congratulations. You've made it here. So my name's Seth Lazar. I'm a professor of philosophy at the Australian National University. I'm one of the general chairs of the conference. Just while I'm up here, I'd like to say, you know, I got in here a bit late yesterday, and so I didn't get to be to do the sort of be there for Alice's original welcome. I want to say a welcome on my part, and also a huge thanks to all of the people who are doing work to make this conference happen, the organizing committee and the student volunteers. So just while we're here, while I've got you, quick round of applause, especially for the student volunteers. They are legends. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Bossware and Algorithmic management. So what's going to happen is I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the topic, and then we're going to have these folks introduce themselves, and we're going to run through a structured conversation for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for Q&A. I'll filter in questions from the online folks who are out there, so hi online folks. And for those of you who are in the room, we'll be going up to the mics as usual. Okay, so just to start off, what are we talking about? So in recent years, accelerated obviously by the global pandemic, employers in all economic sectors, from low wage to high tech, have introduced computational tools that reduce workers' digital and physical autonomy while transferring value from employees to employers and risk in the other direction. So this keynote panel, featuring scholars from across STS, law, computer science, and philosophy, will explore the rise of Bossware and algorithmic management, highlighting key empirical trends and their underlying causes, as well as how workers, researchers, and regulators can fight back. So to start off, I'm going to ask my co-panelists to introduce themselves. We'll go in order from Min here through to Wilneida. So Min, if you'd like to start.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Min Kyung Lee, and I'm assistant professor in the School of Information at UT Austin in the United States. I'm originally from Korea, so it's great to be back at home.
Hi, everyone. My name's Rida. I'm a research scientist with the Responsible AI org at Google. I look at failures and frictions of AI systems as they're deployed in non-Western contexts, and I also research how workers collectively repair and resist and understand the systems that manage them.
Good morning, everybody, or good day, depending on the time zone if you're joining online. I'm Frederik Borgesius, a law professor in the Netherlands, focusing mostly on privacy and non-discrimination in the context of new technologies.
Now you can see why I had them introduce themselves. So now I know how to pronounce Frederik's name.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Wilneida Negron, and I'm from New York. I'm from Coworker, working at the intersections of technology and labor policy.
Thank you, Wilneida. Wilneida's going to be on for a few things as well. So what we wanted to start by doing was talking about, what the target phenomenon is here, like what we're thinking about when we're thinking about Bossware and algorithmic management. Wilneida actually recently authored a report for coworker.org called Little Tech is Coming for Workers. I think it was the full title. If a student volunteer online can grab this, search Wilneida Negron Little Tech and put a link into the chat, that would be great. It's a brilliant catalog of the different ways in which these tools are being used, and a sort of description of the character of the industry that is developing around them. So we thought we'd start by just kind of trying to classify the different tools that are at stake, kind of putting them into different buckets, get a sense of what the target phenomenon is, and then after that we'll talk a little bit about what the underlying cause is. So Wilneida, if you could kick us off.
Yeah, so productivity monitoring tools have been around really since keyword logging many years, but really the past 2 years we've really wanted, because of the pandemic and sort of the flow of venture capital into the innovation spaces, we really wanted to know what was happening the past 2 years. So we started documenting the products that, from talking to workers from across many industries, from retail to finance, to law, to manufacturing, supply chain, really starting to take what was like 1 or 2 products and starting to like compile the database. And so we could identify, you know, what were trends that were happening. And what we generally found was that, you know, there's most of the products that we encountered and documented on the database really fall under, you know, just generic workforce management tools. They are sort of the intended business uses are pretty benign when you think about it. If you've been in a managerial or in an HR role or have family or friends, a lot of it is geared towards managing productivity, maintaining positive culture. When we talk to a lot of H&R people that are sort of seeing some of these vendor and products, are like, well, we're, you know, thinking of ways to build up, you know, morale, and we want to understand, you know, worker sentiment, and we want to, you know, build up a strong workplace culture with, like, you know, where there's accountability. And so that what I want to flag here is that the intended business uses and the actual technology product has a major disconnect. And employers are not well suited to do the due diligence that's needed to know really the products that, for very simple, basic managerial and HR administration work, they're not aware of sort of the power and the lack of transparency of the products that they're bringing in. And so really briefly, the products, and this is not even going into the unintended business uses, which we've also documented, because a lot of the products are being used by employers and industries that have a history of bad labor practices. We are using that these technologies can be weaponized, but some of these very simple managerial tasks that you guys will all encounter in your workplace at some point, but, you know, your employer is now purchasing products that are ranking and scoring workers across many different things, from productivity scores to influence scores, basically analyzing, collecting lots of data points around, you know, where do you spend your time? Who are you connecting with? Physical movements, sentiments in meetings. Microsoft just filed a patent last year to be able to collect sentiment of workers in meetings. To understand, again, it's like the soft, you know, goal of that is to have more successful meetings, but you can also see how it could feed into sort of more malpractice. And so ranking, scoring workers, predicting things from accidents to a worker that's likely to, you know, carry out employee fraud are sort of some of the different types of uses that we're seeing with these different products. And the unintended uses of them is that they have been used by places like Amazon and Whole Foods. They've been used to also understand, you know, where there's like a connection among workers that could lead to organizing or unionization. So it's been used, a lot of these products, again, the unintended business uses are sort of something that's not talked about, of the way that some of the products are used. And so business uses, unintended uses, and basic managerial functions are just disconnected from the products.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Wilneida. I mean, so my experience of this comes from being a white collar worker and having an ongoing argument with my university about mobile device management, which has become just incredibly intrusive without there being any kind of discussion about it within enterprise bargaining agreements. I managed to get this laptop. I mean, I'm saying this online, so I'm probably going to get in trouble now. I managed to get this laptop, bought it myself rather than through university procurement, so that I wouldn't have to get the IT put all of their shit spyware on it, right? I've now nixed that because I've said it in public. But what we wanted to also draw attention to the fact that there is an interesting intersection of the kind of the ways in which these tools are being used for white collar workers and the way they're being used for low wage workers and workers in the global south as well. So Rida, your research has looked at kind of tools of the gig economy and algorithmic management in the global south in Indonesia. Would you sort of tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think before I talk a little bit about how these algorithmic management systems are used for gig workers, I think it's also important to historicize some of the surveillance and scientific management of work. I think sometimes we sort of talk about this process as if it sort of just emerged with modern technologies. And of course, there has been an acceleration of surveillance, but it is, techniques and technologies of surveillance have often been perfected on low power populations and low power contexts, and then they sort of move towards areas of the global north or from blue collar to white collar workers. So I think a lot of these technologies have been perfect, and management techniques have been perfected in plantations, in colonial factories, and now as we see in gig work, in global kind of gig work, and are now moving, as you said, moving towards white collar workers. So this move is definitely not random, and it is not new. I think in the global south, you sort of see a kind of similar experiences of gig workers with surveillance as you see with platforms in the US and the global north. So there are a lot of face tracking technologies. There is a lot of constant GPS logging. There's a lot of data that is being collected on the drivers. The narrative though for that is productivity. The narrative is to make sure that workers don't engage in fraud. And I think there is a similarity between what is happening to workers, to gig workers, and to white collar workers, but that's not to say that the experience is exactly the same, right? So the narratives for a professor like yourself, Seth, might be that the organization wants to protect you from malware, let's say. But the narrative for gig workers is that the organization wants to stop, or the corporation wants to stop gig workers from doing fraud. So there, the worker itself becomes the risky subject that needs to be managed. I think power would also be different. Your power to challenge some of these systems would be very different from a gig worker. And I think the visibility is also interestingly different, but in that case works in the favor of the worker, where surveillance is a lot more visible for the gig worker than it is for you. And I can talk a little bit about how workers sort of resist these.
So we'll definitely come back to that. So one thing I wanted to draw out, so I think many of us will have read some papers by folks up here on this panel and others on this topic. We're sort of aware of it as a phenomenon. We wanted to dig a little bit just quickly into sort of what's causing it, and in particular, the role of venture capital. And so Wilneida did a great discussion of this in the Little Tech report. So Wilneida, could you just sort of tell us a little bit about how venture capital and Little Tech are working together?
Yeah, so really at the beginning of COVID, obviously the market started having economic instability, and usually the way that institutional investors respond in periods of economic uncertainty is that they put their money in riskier asset classes like venture capital. And at the time that COVID was happening, there was really successful tech IPOs that were coming. And so it seemed like a really risky, again, like the beginning of COVID, nobody knows what's going to happen with the economy, put a lot of money into venture capital. And so that is really the past 2 years. It's starting to dwindle now, but the past 2 years, you've seen both the growth of venture capital that is creating a lot of, kind of creating a pressure to grow fast for a lot of startups with like questionable scientific AI methodologies to deal with a variety of, again, like workplace functions and more. And it's also globalized. And so you see much more venture capital going into India, obviously in parts of Africa. So the technology, the money and the products and the companies, the incentives are being globalized. And right now it's like on a somewhat of a decline, but you have also seen a normalization of tech investing. So you saw because of the success of putting money into venture capital, you saw private equity, more traditional market players enter the market. So you have private equity and even hedge funds that were investing in tech companies. And so they were really flooded with money. Private equity took a different model. I don't know if you guys have heard of Tiger Global, but there's like 1 or 4 top major kind of smart growth equity, which are just, again, really dumped a lot of money in tech companies and really like let them grow, gave them whatever technical assistance they needed from Bain Capital. And so companies the past 2 years, I think really just to kind of summarize it, we've really have been at a rapid period of technological innovation, and the number of products just that that have emerged from the past 2 years exceed over 200. Again, that deals specifically with productivity measurement. There's much more products that touch on the labor process that we documented, but 200 and possibly growing. And so for us, it's been a matter of like, how do we respond at the industry level? Because we can't fight one company. We can't organize one company after the other. What are the regulatory, how can we modernize a regulatory response? And also thinking about empowering workers to have a voice.
Thank you, Wilneida. So this gives us hopefully a sort of a picture of, you know, what's happening and why it's happening. We want to talk about like why it matters and, you know, what the harms are next. So I want to say a little bit about this as a philosopher. Like one of the things that I think that, you know, this is intended to sort of illustrate how interdisciplinary collaboration can work. And one of the things that I think philosophy can help us do is look at a problem where, you know, it feels like something's really icky, feels like it's wrong, feels like there's something bad going on there, and sort of parse out what the different harms are and sort of articulate them and find foundations for them, see how they fit together. And actually, in that regard, there's a paper I'd love to recommend to you. I'll put it in the chat later on for those online, by Kate Vredenberg on alienation and algorithmic management in Canadian Journal of Philosophy. So there's different sort of dimensions, I think, of the harms that are at stake. Like Wilneida talked a little bit before about the very concrete harms of, you know, identifying people when they're organizing and being able to track them and sort of effectively use these tools for union busting. There's more sort of intrinsic harms as well to the sort of the practice of algorithmic management, the way in which it leads to people being sort of surveilled, feeling like everything they're doing is being watched, like they're not trusted, and can lead to a certain kind of alienation from the work one's doing. You know, whether that be white collar or low wage work, whatever it might be, the sense that you're constantly being kind of metricized and ranked and sorted is clearly something that can feel dehumanizing for people. Another key trend that has been found, in particular in the work of Karen Levy, a fact OG, is this idea about risk transfer. So, and the idea that you essentially what a lot of these tools do is they make things more efficient by transferring risk from the employer to the employee. So a nice example that she's done, I think, and also in work with you, Min, which you could maybe talk about, is the example of using real-time scheduling in order to sort of take away workers' free time. So maybe you could say a little bit about that, and if you have other views on the kind of harms that are at stake, that'd be great too.
Yeah. So actually, I was going to also mention some of the worker strategy as well, if that's possible. Yeah. Yeah, so in our work, we look at the context of the computerized or automatic scheduling program. And there is a lot of research that shows that how that scheduling practice has physical, financial, and psychological harms on workers. Because that getting like how many shifts, like how many hours of work directly determine their incomes. And because the algorithmic scheduling based on like prediction of demands make it very unstable, so that people have hard time predicting how much they will earn in the next 2 weeks. And it can pose also threat to like people who have to pay rent and who don't have enough savings to be able to handle the uncertainty posed by these uncertain and very unpredictable algorithms. So yeah, that's like one downside of the harms.
So just to tee up the next bit. So one thing we also wanted to do was we didn't want to present this as a kind of, you know, sort of technological determinism. The tools come in and they just sort of, they impact on people regardless of what people do. Like we're all just sort of playthings of the technologies that affect us. Like the reality is that workers, when they are faced with these tools, do things like me with my phone, with my laptop. We find ways of getting around them. We find ways of fighting back and sort of co-opting these different tools. There's some great examples of this. Many of you could talk about it a bit, but then also Rida has got some great examples of people doing this in the gig economy in Indonesia.
So I think there is at this point, like there is a lot of research and documents like how gig workers cope with the platform algorithms. Like I really like the work by Moman and Jermelson and also Camera, where they classify these workers, different types of worker strategy to regain the control. Like one example will be resisting, meaning not using it at all, like not accepting the rides. Or switching, because at least in gig work you have some options, like several platforms, so you choose different options depending on the kind of work that you get. You also kind of engage in collective sense making, so that you know like how these different algorithms may work and whether the bonus that you're getting is fair or equivalent to other workers, and etc. But I think what's very interesting is that when these software are being used in more traditional workplaces, it's harder to fight back. Like one example is against scheduling. Like it's known that people can swap their shift among themselves if they don't like the schedule they get. But still, it's really hard to just find a new workplace because they don't like this algorithmic software, or like complain to their boss all the time because they don't like softwares, because it's much more embedded in their existing power dynamics. So like fighting the algorithm management, finding workaround becomes harder. Rita.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of my work is around how resistance is contextual, and resistance to a lot of this algorithmic management is contextual. And I think so far a lot of work has been very US centric, or kind of like centered around West experiences of workers in Western contexts. And we kind of look at resistance either as, logging off and kind of refusing work, or kind of like on the other spectrum, collective organizing, bargaining, unionization. And that's not possible necessarily for workers around the world, and that's not necessarily things that they would they'd want to do. So I've looked at how workers in Jakarta actually use technology itself to subvert the surveillance of algorithmic management. So workers build their own gray market apps, they circulate them on WhatsApp and Telegram. They use things like GPS spoofing. They use they leverage and exploit glitches in the security architecture of the platform itself to create emancipatory technological potentials for themselves. And I think that was really interesting to think about workers in this more agentic way, but also understand that there's a lot of technological innovation that's coming out that is exploiting the gaps and frictions of existing technology.
That's great. Okay, so the next sort of step is to think about like, where do we go from here? And we've been talking as a panel about sort of 3 different paths that we want to discuss. So one's going to be looking at the role of regulation. One's going to be looking at collective bargaining. And one's going to be looking at whether there are technological paths forward as well here. Starting off with regulation. So Frederik, and as an Australian, it's almost impossible for me to not shorten your name. So congratulations. I mean, I could call you Fredo. So Frederik, let's talk about the kind of regulatory solutions, responses here. I mean, on the one hand, you've got data protection, but then you've also got the prospective AI Act in the EU. What do you think the right kind of regulatory toolkit would be for dealing with algorithmic management and Bossware?
Thank you. And since you're Australian, from you, I'll accept Fred, but not generally. I really prefer Frederik. Let's first focus on the data protection law, because that actually exists on the books already, and we have to see what the end result of the AI Act will be. That's still a proposal. And although Europe has one of the most advanced data protection laws with the GDPR, there's now 130 countries in the world which have basically copied, or at least have the same core principles as the GDPR. For instance, in South Korea, Japan. So data protection law isn't a solution for all the problems in this field, but it is definitely a necessary step. So if you're in a country without a data protection law, a good first step would be start lobbying for something like that. And I'll focus a bit on what the GDPR could do. Firstly, it's good to keep in mind that unlike some media summarize it, the GDPR isn't only about privacy, but is in general about fairness and protecting human rights and individual interests in the context of personal data use. So one important, it's a long statute, so I'll just highlight a few relevant bits. One important principle, and that is in all data protection laws in the world, is the principle of transparency, and that can help to open the black box of this algorithmic management system. So companies using AI to manage workers, they have to explain, for instance, in a privacy notice what they're doing. And we all know that normal people don't read privacy notices, but it can help researchers and labor unions and journalists, etc. And in most data protection laws, and definitely in the GDPR, you have a right to ask to any organization, show me what personal data you have on me. So, and indeed, you see gig workers doing that to the company. Like, you don't have to hire a lawyer, just send an email, show me what you have on me. So these are very important rights. And there are many principles in data protection law that just aim to limit surveillance. So this is all very useful. And if I have a bit more of time, there is also, this is quite typical for European data protection law, but it seems to be spreading around the world. There's also in the GDPR a specific provision on automated decision making. It's quite complicated, but I'll summarize it very roughly. If a company or an organization takes fully automated decisions about people, then in certain cases, if the decisions have legal or similarly significant effect, basically far-reaching effects, then the victim, so the individual, has a right to an explanation. And I was a bit skeptical. I love the thinking behind it, but there are various loopholes in the provision. So I have even written it down a few times, like, I'm not sure whether this is going to fly. But last year, there was a court case in the Netherlands about a company called Ola. And it's basically an Uber-like company operating in India. But many companies worldwide establish themselves in the Netherlands because, I apologize, I vote for other parties, but the Netherlands enables a lot of tax dodging. So this Ola company operating an Uber-like app in India established themselves in Amsterdam. So some gig workers, drivers were angry and sued them in Amsterdam. And the Amsterdam judge said, yeah, you're established here. So you can sue them and use the GDPR. And these drivers, the money they were getting for a ride was cut by the algorithm. Apparently the algorithm kind of expected fraud, or the drivers didn't know. And they said, well, this is a fully automated decision. It hurts me. I get less money than I expected. So I want an explanation. And the judge said, yes, indeed, you have a right to an explanation of this algorithmic decisions. So that at least it illustrates that the provision can and is actually being applied in practice.
That's great. One thing I'd like to flag is that tomorrow our community keynote describes a story of workers organizing and being helped by a researcher to do this sort of work of figuring out how a change in a payment algorithm led to a different distribution of payments among delivery workers. So make sure you tune in for the community keynote tomorrow, and we'll be talking with Wilneida again then. And it's a good example actually of the role that collective organization plays in fighting back against these different tools. So coworker.org, is it coworker.org or just coworker? It feels like the website is yeah. I mean, it feels like that's part of the branding as well. So coworker is one example of sort of bringing together gig economy workers to do this. I think that there's a role for collective bargaining in more traditional contexts as well. Like I think that, in Australia, we have a pretty good enterprise bargaining system. We have pretty robust university unions. And I think that it's the next step. Like, it still hasn't quite happened, and I've been a bit lazy about trying to make it happen. But it's like, I think that these sorts of provisions should absolutely be part of collective bargaining. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think the right pathways are for organizing, both kind of with the workers, the co-workers working with, but also across other sectors, even including, well, we'll come to tech companies in a minute with Rida.
Yeah, happy to. Well, I mean, for the sectors where there are unions, it's been a matter of educating and trying. I mean, a lot of the traditional labor unions in the US, they're really, I mean, they will tell you, and we've done presentations about these tools, like, we're concerned about them, but, our workers are, concerned about bread and butter issues. And so in the scheme of a variety of issues that they should be concerned about, most workers aren't really completely like taking the step. I mean, they're outraged, but taking a step where you actually start to request more rights than just transparency or explainability. You actually organize for collective bargaining rights. Around this, in the US, the Major League Baseball union is probably the most organized and proactive in the language around the data that's collected from sports players. They have very aggressive language, and so we've taken that model language to different sectors of, like, this is a kind of language that you should be adopting or organizing around, that really create a baseline set of protections for workers. And that is, again, you're sort of competing with questions around quality jobs. And so the question, the challenge, or the opportunity, to be optimistic, is to really connect these issues with bread and butter concerns and questions around quality jobs. And so does the next generation of quality jobs, does it entail having workers report that they have, stress and mental health issues because of, like, the constant monitoring, and that brings up safety issue? Does concerns about lack of transparency, they're getting paid through automated systems like gig economy workers, does the lack of transparency, does that contribute to quality jobs in the future? So it's always about framing it around, like, economic harms and economic exploitation in order to get, again, the labor unions to actively start organizing our workers on. The other piece, really, which the community panel that I'll be talking in, we did that study which shaped workers, but there's an incredible burden right now on workers and civil society to really gather the evidence through the technical investigation of these products, to win themselves rights at the state or the local level. And so Shipped was, organizing Shipped workers to start collecting their receipts. And Dan Kalecki will talk about it more, but he created a bot that basically started automating these. That creates, can we duplicate that across all of the many hundreds of places where, wage theft is actively happening due to an algorithm? Like, that is not realistic. And so the challenges for us is, like, we want to make how can we scale sort of what Dan has done? And that'll be a conversation. And the other thing is, regulatory agencies are like, we want to do something and want to provide rulemaking, at least in absence in the US of any kind of protection consumer privacy law. We want to do some rulemaking, at least to notify, and we are having to test, in this particular context, automated AI hiring and recruitment tools to gather the evidence so that they will be able to sort of understand within every regulatory agency has in the US their own little catchment area that they can regulate on. And so, working with the field on testing strategies where civil society, advocacy groups, and workers can understand how they can test is a very technical thing. And I do this work with other civil society groups and workers. Like, when we get a computer scientist to help us, is like, Dan sort of like fell from heaven and I was like, yes, we can use you immediately. And so, but that's really not the norm.
Thank you, Wilneida. Okay, so I think actually we're going to invert the next questions that you guys were prepared for, because that leads really well into this question of like what sort of how do we do worker-centric research that realizes well, so both realizes any benefits that might be had from these technologies, but also kind of mitigates their harms. So you've just given an example of sort of the kind of research that PhD students out there in this audience and online. Or not just PhD students, but anyone who's got enough time to take on a new research project. So yeah, PhD students can think about doing like, and so one of the questions that I think that comes with that is like, how do you do it in a way that is genuinely worker-centric, that responds to people's needs, that is not extractive, and that is sensitive to the sort of the different dynamics that are going on, and where are there opportunities for doing kind of fact-style research that will be really beneficial in this context. In a minute, we're going to come to the research that we should avoid, but let's start with with the positives. So maybe Min, if you could have a
Yeah. So I think in line with what Frederik said about the importance of transparency and explanations and data sharing, one thing that I think is really important is a lot of those collected data, like start sharing the data with workers themselves. Like that's one first step, but it's not enough usually. And if we think about the companies, they use the data so that they can earn more money. Like they mine the data, they get insight. But if you just share the raw data with workers, it's very hard for them to actually get actual benefits from the data. So I think what's really very important is thinking about how can we actually also help these workers themselves to benefit from their own data. And like, for example, how can we actually leverage data so that each worker can earn more money and be more efficient in terms of completing the task or executing the work, etc. So I think that's one like very important area of work. And the other kind of one that I want to briefly touch on is also kind of thinking about like computational ways to incorporate the workers' priority into this system as well. So we do like a lot of our research in the community. We've been like even including ones that got the best paper award, I think this year, is thinking about like how we do more worker-centered design, co-design, and I think community keynote tomorrow is also excellent example. And but I also was equally important thing will be getting the input and informing the design of the systems like qualitatively, but also thinking about like how can we actually include these worker priorities into the optimization itself? Because at the end, a lot of these systems are based on AI, machine learning, automation. So if you want to kind of incorporate their inputs or priority, like their income or well-being, like thinking about how to quantify them and include them in the optimizations will be an important area.
Thank you, Min. So Rida, if you could speak maybe just a little both to the sort of the positives, like how to do participatory research in a way that goes beyond the kind of the headline slogan and actually makes it real, but also a little bit about what kind of research we should be avoiding and be, in our own choices at least.
Yeah, I think so. First, it's obviously very important to think about what different kinds of expertise different people bring. So you, of course, as a researcher, bring certain kinds of expertise, but then workers are also bringing a lot of expertise. So in my experience in Jakarta, workers had very sophisticated understanding of the algorithmic systems that were managing them, and also very clear ideas of what were things that they wanted out of potential research projects that could help them, whether that was data visualization, building an app that helped, building a platform app that helped them visualize different parts of the city in a much more contextual way than existing maps were doing. So I think, yes, I think one thing is to just really build these kinds of relationships of trust with workers and relationships of care also, because a lot of times researchers become very extractive. We sort of go in with our own idea of what workers want, and then we sort of disappear out of their lives forever. So I think that's sort of one thing of thinking through what relationships of care and trust would look like. I think in terms of the kinds of research to avoid, I think oftentimes there's research that's often very acontextual. So it kind of forgets that a lot of these technological systems and workers' responses to these systems are enmeshed in existing institutions, in histories of work, in, for example, in the Global South, in existing management styles, in power relationships, in existing cultures of informal work, in existing cultures of solidarity and relationships and networks of mutual aid. I think if we forget that, we then end up centering technology as if it's moving from the boardroom to the streets in this pristine way, unchallenged, unchanged, which is of course not true. I think we also have to think about how not to do research that is, again, like very US-centric or very universal, and also think about ways to develop as sort of global labor markets converge in some ways in our experiences across sectors and across regions. Think about how we can build truly these kind of cross-sectoral and global solidarities. And by global, I don't just mean like kind of, sometimes people say global and they basically mean North America and Europe, but really global in like truly not just thinking about like north to south learning or top to bottom learning, but kind of south to north learning, because workers in the global south have been fighting against, in conditions of precarity, against intensive surveillance and using technologies agentically to subvert these processes and gain power. So I think kind of like learning from those strategies, and as researchers, positioning ourselves as people who can learn from those strategies from the south to the north, I think would be pretty incredible.
Fantastic, thank you. So we haven't got through all of our questions, but I want to open up to the audience now. So the way we'll do the Q&A, so if you're on the if you're online, then put your questions in the Q&A. Also go in there and upvote questions that you think are interesting. If you're here in the room, put your hand up and come to a microphone. So go ahead now. We have a question at the back, gentleman in the blue shirt there. It's going to take you a while to get to a microphone, so I'll take one from the microphone's up here. If you just come up to the microphone if you want to do a question rather than put hands up. Let me just quickly do one from the chat here. All right, so Aaron, yeah, we'll do yours in a minute. Oh, Michele, hi. So Aaron has got, can I play devil's avocado for a moment? Thank you, Aaron, for your creative use of emojis. Is there a place for Bossware surveillance and monitoring of metrics being used to improve productivity in workplaces, for example, through gamification and foregrounding of competition? So, Wilneida, if you could maybe take this one to start with, where have you found sort of among you talked about the kind of the benign intentions that you often see. How's that worked for you? What do you think?
I wanted to see I'll answer the question, but absolutely. Are there ways to be able to design and innovate in the workplace environment? And we see companies that are coming in and are, incorporating responsible innovation, centering workers really in the development, implementation. And so I think that there's just a lack of standard for the next generation of companies that actually have seen and attend these conferences and learn about these uses that want to do things differently. And there's just not as strong of a community for those tech companies to, share ideas. And so absolutely there's a place. There's a lot of emerging technologies in the metaverse or, Web3, a lot of DAOs, DAOs that are emerging, using tokenism and decentralized networks to organize workers or just, create new organizational cultures that are flatter in the workplace. I think there's just a lot of really, really exciting. It's just we need to have sort of an ethical grounding, which is unfortunate because we spend a lot of time talking about ethics and fairness, but we're not really moving at the speed of technology innovation. And so we continue to innovate without having sort of a society and like at the workplace level, like what do we, if we don't want technology done to us, we want it to be done with us, like what is the ethical underpinning of that conversation and how can we make that actionable for the next generation of tech companies. I don't know if I answered your question.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So what I'd like to do next is, if you just introduce yourself, obviously I know who you are, but introduce yourself and then ask your question. And other folks who would like to ask questions in the audience, just go and stand by a microphone and I'll call on you when it's time.
Michele Eloy, I'm a political philosopher by training and working on these issues, also a project on this type of applications in Switzerland. So I wanted to ask you just a clarification question, or maybe just to give us a bit more insight about one aspect, because you seem to include two types of data-driven processes and applications. One is the software which can be used within human resources, and the other is the use of data-driven applications within platform work, gig work, and so on. And while clearly there are commonalities between the two, I wanted to ask you just if you could say a bit more about what are the distinctions between the roles of data and algorithms in these two fields. Thank you.
I think many people could have something to say about that. Anyone want to volunteer? Rida?
I think there are kind of like base level commonalities, of course, in, as I sort of mentioned earlier, where the basic idea of surveilling the worker as a risky subject are common. I think sometimes the narratives, of course, vary in terms of, you know, using it for productivity or using it for protecting consumers. I think one big difference is that for platforms, their actual function is impossible without this kind of granular data collection on both the user and the worker, because a lot of the platforms, quote unquote, innovations are centered on real-time monitoring, real-time tracking, real-time data collection, and then using that to, you know, kind of like change wage or nudge drivers in certain locations, or, you know, kind of like deactivate people who are not following the rules of the platform. So I think the data-driven tools and techniques of surveillance and management are really just inextricable from the business model of the platform itself. For a lot of these HR-driven softwares, that's not necessarily true. I think the business model itself of the company doesn't necessarily rely on them, and maybe that's where sort of you could have a little bit more room for resistance and power for workers. So yeah, I think that's sort of like one big difference that I see.
That's very helpful, I think. So I'll take another question from the chat in the Q&A. By the way, folks online, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A rather than the chat, so I only have to monitor one thing, because I'm multitasking here. So Ushnish Sengupta has asked, many non-profits are adopting surveillance technologies for the same reason as other types of organizations. Should we hold non-profit organizations to a higher standard of ethics on surveillance of workers, or should they be treated the same as all other organizations? Fred, did you want to? You're looking animated.
Oh, yes, I would definitely say that we should keep both the state and NGOs to a higher standard than companies that are driven by profit. Definitely, no question for me.
How do you feel about universities?
Also, yeah, a much higher standard, yes.
I agree. There's no defense of ignorance. Yeah. Good, thanks, Fred. Okay. Frederik. All right, person here.
Hi, I'm Divij. Thank you for a really insightful panel. So I think one thing that kind of seems abundantly clear from everybody's inputs is that the questions of kind of algorithmic management are very much enmeshed, as Rida said, in the business model, or kind of, you know, more structurally embedded in the kind of economy within which these technologies are created. So at a place like this, when, you know, and I'm not so much for solutionism in a sense, but what is the agenda, therefore, when we're seeking to counter tools like this, right? If you're looking at a kind of a structural issue or structural problem, making different technological tools or improving those tools isn't going to help. The GDPR kind of, again, it might be helpful in a sense, but again, looks at it as a problem of individual data protection and not as a structural problem of the economy or of political organizing. And so I don't know, history has taught us some lessons about how, say, when industry and when economies change, kind of laws respond to that, or workers can respond to that. What does the agenda in this kind of economy look like?
Yeah, sure. So Frederik will come in. I'd like to sort of use this as an opportunity also to talk about something we didn't get to, which was the role of tech worker organizing, because it feels like that's in part a response to this type of question. I mean, labor organizing in general, but certainly folks who are in the positions of where they have the ability to influence the companies that are developing these technologies seem to be well placed. But Frederik, if you could respond, then maybe Rida, you could speak to the tech worker part as a tech worker.
Yeah. Thank you. I was really happy with this question because I could now I can emphasize again. I don't want to suggest that the GDPR is the solution. It is just I'm pragmatic and we have that on the book, so let's use what we have now. But if we zoom out a bit, like the question asker suggested, we see a really big change in how employment is done. Also in rich countries with functioning welfare states like the Netherlands, like millions of people are now in gig work where they don't have pension payments, where they don't know whether they have a salary next month, etc. So now we're in a situation like basically like at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we had to invent all these statutes that limit working hours, that limit working days for factory safety, etc. And now technology and economic powers have extremely quickly changed employment conditions for millions of people, and we need many building blocks to make society fairer again. Also in rich countries with good welfare states, that is also the rights of workers are being sabotaged, basically. So I don't have all the answers yet, but many new types of labor laws, competition laws, perhaps to cut up some of the larger companies. Many measures have to be taken.
So acknowledging that one of the key features of the report was that it highlighted the role of little tech, that Wilneida, so this is the report that Wilneida did, so that this isn't just a problem of the big tech companies, it's a problem of lots of little tech companies being developed that are pursuing these tools. I think it is good in this opportunity to take this opportunity just to quickly talk about organizing by tech workers, Rida. So if you could maybe just sort of give us a few thoughts on the role that you think that might play.
Yeah, I think as sort of a newly minted tech worker, take my comments with a grain of salt. I haven't been in this industry for a long time. I think it's important to use your power to hold power structures accountable where and as you can. And sort of tech workers are not just tech workers, right? They're technologists who kind of can design, co-design technology with workers, as Wilneida was pointing out. They're also citizens, so they can kind of exercise their power to organize and to demand transparency and accountability outside the organization also. And a lot of us are also researchers, so we can figure out ways to do sort of more worker-centered and critical research. I think the organization question is really, really interesting. I think white collar, before I say that, I think it's also important to remember that as white collar, let's say high-paying tech workers, the kinds of surveillance that we are right now researching on like gig workers in the global south is also coming for all of us. That is sort of what we have seen in history. A lot of these technologies and strategies of surveillance are perfected on certain populations and then are filtered to the rest of the world. So that's something I think, sort of no one is safe. That's something to remember. I think tech workers are also enmeshed in different layers of precarity and power. So questions of visa status for tech workers in the US. A tech worker in the same company with the same title in India will have very different power to resist management than, like, let's say in the US, just because the way these global companies, the power structures of these global companies work, where a lot of power is centered in HQ. in the US. So I think just kind of recognizing the different privilege and precarity that your coworkers have, and then sort of finding out where you yourself have most power to organize and push back for transparency, but also remembering that transparency without agency is pretty useless. So you could have transparency as a first step measure and then push for measures that will give you more agency and power as workers. And organizing is definitely one way to do that. But I also want to mention there are a lot of other ways outside organizing that are also helpful, because kind of like building these networks of mutual aid and trust that workers in Jakarta at least showed me can be as effective as kind of a first step towards that collective bargaining step.
Wonderful, thank you. So, Wilneida, just before Wilneida responds, I just want to flag that as well as the community keynote tomorrow, which provides an example of the kind of research that can be done in this space, there's also going to be a craft session that Wilneida and Dan are going to be leading, which is going to be about sort of helping researchers sort of think through how to develop kind of worker-centric fact-type research. So strong encouragement to show up for that if you can. Wilneida.
Yeah, no, I think it's no secret that there's a fundamental lack of corporate governance structures in tech companies, both through like the shareholder ownership structure, where the CEO retains most of the decision-making power, as in the case of Facebook. And so there are, kind of the question that was asked, well, why tech workers organize was there's no corporate governance. There is no seat at the table for workers to be able to say, I didn't realize that this thing I was building is going to be used to surveil immigrants or to deport, vulnerable communities. And so there was no voice for them at the table for them to do that. And the ownership structure in tech companies are so that don't allow that. So that is just a problem in the tech industry. And so why it's important, why this conversation intersects into the new economy space, because there is a lot of conversations around whether it's Trevor Schultz and platform cooperativism from New School. There's a lot of gig workers that have started, have kicked Uber out. It's happening in New York City. I mean, Uber's still pretty popular, but it happened in Texas. Workers created their own co-op. There's stewardship models that are being explored. There are different alternative business structures for tech companies that are emerging in response to sort of like, is this the economy that we want? Is like, these big tech companies with no corporate governance where you're just constantly fighting an uphill, or do we need to reimagine something new? And
thank you. Okay, so I want to flag that I know that we're at time, but there's some questions still to go. If anyone needs to break out and go to the toilet, whatever, feel free. I do have a person on the online Q&A who I want to acknowledge. I don't think we're going to get time to go through this, but Kyla Chazalo has raised the point about workplace surveillance technologies being connected to those used in education. So I don't think we're going to have time to address this, but the relationship between, I think the point that Rida made about how sort of the initial power imbalance kind of determines the degree to which we're willing to use surveillance technologies. I think that idea applies very well in the case of education. Certainly at the start of the pandemic, loads of universities were rolling out these awful online invigilation tools. Because the students didn't really have voice, they were just rolled out, and it took a bunch of legal proceedings for them actually to get kind of stopped. So I think it is a really good example of there being another commonality of interest there. And I think that actually among those of you who are PhD students who are forming, who are barracking to form unions, I know that there's been some discussion of this at CMU with surveillance in the workplace there. I think it's good to sort of link together all of these different dots. Again, it's coming for all of us, this stuff. So the final question will have to be the person over there with the sunglasses.
Thank you. My name is Alec Askelson. I work at a company called Parity. I think my question is for Rida, although of course I'm interested in the thoughts of all the other panelists as well. Rida, in your description of global learning being a process of knowledge is developed in the global south, actually transferring to the global north to apply to situations where the tools of surveillance, right, are moving to the interior, at least of this country, right? I hear in that description a critique of also research methodologies that researchers are applying, like an assumption that they're assuming objective positions, And so then also there I hear like notes of the critical pedagogy school, like notes of Paulo Freire and bell hooks. And I'm not necessarily convinced though that like English and American sociology programs, much less computer science programs, in their research methodology courses, if those are even on the books, are introducing students to critical research methodologies. Tawana Petty, for example, I think in an answer to a question on a panel yesterday, noted that researchers who are attempting to take an objective stance may actually be assuming an ideological stance through a variety of positive and negative choices. And so for, certainly for myself, but also perhaps for the PhD students in the room, right, the researchers, we may have to drive ourselves personally to very different literature bases. And so I'm wondering if the panel has any suggestions, perhaps even a kind of call to action, like maybe the simplest way to phrase it is like, okay, but what should we be reading? I'm very curious where you think we should be driving ourselves towards more critical perspectives in research methodologies. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that question because I think especially computer science pedagogy has been hugely on my mind. Lately, I'm not a computer scientist, but you know, places like FACT give me an opportunity to engage with you know, just excellent researchers who have sort of created their own critical curriculum, or computer scientists who sort of created their own critical curriculum. I think I have really relied on post-colonial theories, particularly post-colonial urban studies literature, to bring in questions of context and think about how resistance from quote-unquote the urban poor are theorized in canon. And then, of course, I think Black and feminist theory, particularly in geography and in sociology, I think have been really helpful. I'm happy to sort of talk. You know, I don't think we have time to list out authors, but I'm definitely happy to talk after the panel on thinking about what a curriculum, what a kind of a critical theory curriculum for computer scientists would look like, because that's definitely a passion project of mine.
Wonderful. So, and I think that here we can take advantage of the affordances of the platform that we're using. If you have reading suggestions, get onto this session within Hopin and put them in the chat there. Let's try and keep that as an ongoing discussion that will stay live throughout the conference and for a few days afterwards. All right, we are out of time now, so I'd like you all to join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion.
I'd like to make just a quick announcement for those who've taken the PCR test. The student volunteers will have your results, because a lot of you didn't have the local phone number. So the student volunteers who are sitting at the registration desk, you should go to them and ask for your result. And secondly, if you are going for a PCR test today or tomorrow, please be on time, because if it gets delayed, then the next session gets delayed and so on. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great, everybody. You did so well.